I was in the Army, and while away on a 4-day pass, my barracks room was broken into and a significant amount of my military equipment, helmet, backpack, weapons, web belt, ammo carrier, etc., was stolen to the tune of approximately $800 in 1984 dollars. When all returned, there were tool marks on the locked room door, and it was clearly a break-in. I notified my platoon sergeant and first sergeant, and they said to call the military police. Then the company commander/commanding officer, who outranked us, called me and stated he didn't want the break-in being reported to the military police because then our company would show up in the higher level, division, police blotter, and this would make him, the company commander/commanding officer, CO, look bad. So he told me to do a report of survey, a form used to be reimbursed for lost equipment, and I wouldn't have to pay for the stolen equipment, whose replacement costs were a month's pay. Well, submitted the paperwork, and without the police report, my request to be reimbursed was denied, and I was told I would have to pay for all the stolen equipment. I was shocked because it was a lot of money, and I was just about to leave the Army to go back to college. I needed that money to survive. The CO told me it was a tough break, and there was nothing he could do to help me, even though it was his orders I had followed. Well, turns out, just a week before we found out that division would not replace my stolen equipment, I had led our company through a nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons evaluation exercise. That was my specialty in the Army. And the spineless CO sat out the exercise and just observed. This placed me in a leadership position to do his job, while a captain from our division HQ graded our actions. I was a junior sergeant who had to maneuver, lead, and direct the whole company of 120 men, including senior lieutenants, to a staging area 5 miles away, through the security procedures to secure the decontamination site, and then lead the cleaning of our men, tanks, and equipment from the simulated chemical attack. I had never maneuvered an armored company before, but I did it, and the other sergeants and lieutenants in the unit were shocked that the CO hadn't helped me during the exercise. The process went well, and at the end, a captain from division who was evaluating us congratulated me on doing a good job. In front of the company, this captain then explained our next steps we would do. He made a mistake and told the troops wrong information, that in combat would get them killed. I was leaving the Army, but all cared enough about my fellow soldiers to want them to be combat proficient. So politely and respectfully I corrected what the captain had said, but he clearly resented me making him look silly. I guess he was embarrassed a lower-ranking soldier corrected him, and that made him noticeably embarrassed. At the end of the debriefing, I was walking back to my armored vehicle to radio our HQ that now we had completed our decontamination, a requirement of the exercise, and were operational again. And this captain followed me, away from the other soldiers. He asked what I was going to do, and I told him I was about to make the radio call to HQ, and he told me that wouldn't be necessary. I could just tell him what I would say. I told him, and he told me our unit had passed the evaluation. Luckily for me, my first sergeant overheard him say this to me. Now fast forward to where I'll find out that my equipment would not be replaced, and a couple days later, I was called into the CO's office with my first sergeant and told our company had flunked the training evaluation because I hadn't made that radio call. I was getting out of the Army, so didn't really care, but it was bad news for my CO. I was shocked because the other captain, who outranked me, told me not to make the radio call that our unit was decontaminated and operational again. Turns out that the captain was immature and mad at me, since I had embarrassed him in front of all the soldiers in my unit. I still was angry at the CO for ordering me not to call the police about my barracks room break-in, and how he didn't care that I would now have to pay a lot of money to replace my stolen equipment. So I didn't defend myself or tell the CO what really happened with the evaluation or that captain. When I left the cause office, the first sergeant told me he heard the other captain tell me not to make that radio call, but not to say anything. Our CO was a jerk who would get us all killed in a war, and his unit flunking the evaluation made him look really bad, so he asked me to keep my mouth shut. A couple weeks later, the CO was rude to a sick soldier in our unit, while Ol was out processing to leave the army. Everyone hated him even more for this, so our supply sergeant, who was retiring from the army, and after the CO signed for all the military equipment in the supply room, told me he couldn't believe the CO had screwed me over on my stolen equipment and that he would help me. So he handed me the keys to the supply room that the CO hadn't collected and told me to take whatever military equipment Ol would need to replace my stolen equipment, since the CO was now responsible to replace everything in the supply room with his money. He also apologized that some of the replacement equipment Ol would need was not in the supply room, and he felt bad Ol would still have to pay a couple $100 out of pocket to replace some of the stolen equipment. The supply surgeon also answered my questions about where all the backup training logs for our unit's weapons and physical training tests were kept. We were about to be inspected by higher headquarters, and these records were super important for the CO to pass the inspection and be promoted and not be kicked out of the army. The day before Ol got out of the army with an honorable discharge, and just a couple days before this huge important inspection, it was discovered that the whole company's year's worth of weapons training records, the backup records and electronic records, were missing or wiped clean. The CO had to explain this embarrassing situation to his bosses, who were not happy with him. His unit had already flunked the NBC evaluation, and now his unit had failed to properly maintain training records. Even worse, his unit's training budget was completely over budget, with costs off the charts, and the division had to come up with a lot of money to cover the ammo costs to requalify the whole company on all our weapons, plus time from other duties to redo our physical tests. PT, of running, push-ups, etc., just as bad. Advanced training would have to be canceled to redo all the basic weapons qualification training that had to be completed once again. There was no way the CO could avoid receiving a bad performance appraisal, which would end any chance of him getting promoted, thus effectively ending his military career. Meanwhile, my fellow soldiers loved it because they liked to shoot machine guns, throw grenades, shoot cannons, etc. My last day in the army, at morning formation, as everyone was getting ready to do the makeup PT test, and later all day doing makeup weapon qualifications for several more days, my awesome first sergeant told me that the disappearing records was the best ETS, end term of service, prank he had ever seen. I of course replied that Ol didn't know what he was talking about. He laughed, winked at me, and told me Ol was a good soldier and that he would miss me. He then shook my hand and wished me well.
Next story.
So this happened back in high school, involving one very dear friend and his manic sociopath of a buddy. Let me outline the cast of this beautiful production. First, there was our victim, who was possibly just the nicest dude I have ever encountered in my life. I'll call him ND. His home life was pretty good, while it was just him and his mother. His mother was incredibly busy working a very high-paying job to give him a comfortable life, and as such she wasn't home often. So to make up for that, and to assure her son was living comfortably, she provided him with an insane weekly allowance, like $500 insane. And so, of course, being a teenager with more expendable income than he knew what to do with, he constantly blew it on weed, electronics, and nice clothes. Despite his comfortable living situation, he was by and large just a great dude. Always spent money on his friends, shared his weed, had movie nights. Honestly, I think he just felt a little lonely and wanted to share what he had with people he cared about. Then we have the agent of chaos in this story. We will call this absolute fucking maverick Horse, due to an equally illogical high school nickname that he demanded everyone call him. Horse and I were buddies, mainly due to equal parts self-preservation and edgy teenage nihilism that simply wanted to release his special brand of unhinged out into the world. He was the friend you made because it was not a matter of if he got sent to jail, but when, and you really rather not have your name be a part of that headline. This wasn't to say that Horse was a bad dude. Talking to him was pretty chill for the most part, and I genuinely enjoyed our time together. but you got the vibe that there was this underlying problem going untreated. A nice enough dude if you were friends, didn't even really ever argue with people, but if you wronged him then might as well skip the country and change your name. Horst didn't deal in an eye for an eye. He wanted your teeth, eyes, and maybe a few fingers while he was at it. Horst also bought a wild animal off of someone at school. This is unrelated to the story at hand, but I feel it paints the picture of just the kind of impulsive teenage boy who purchases a wild animal that another teenager clearly just found somewhere outside and brought into the school, all without having a single clue of how to care for it. I'm going to leave what type of animal unspecified, as it was the same as his nickname, but we'll say that it was a dog-sized herbivore that lived uncaged on his bedroom floor for several years. So into the story. ND came to school one day looking like he just got dragged behind a car for a few blocks. We're talking busted blood vessels in his eye, scrapes and cuts, as well as several swollen bits on his face. He was, and still is I suppose, a very dark-skinned guy, so just how bruised he was I can't tell you. But I was going to hazard the guess, super. Normal friend reactions, including my own, were immediate concern, asking if he needed to go to the hospital, if he was all right, and what happened. Turns out he had invited a few guys over to his place the night before to smoke weed, bought and paid for by him, and play video games. Upon seeing ND's apartment and all his fancy toys, they decided to repay his kindness by beating the ever-loving crap out of him and horking his stuff. Rational friends told him to file a police report, to which he waved them off, not wanting to cause more issues, not to mention they had been smoking. Less rational friends suggested he get a strap, which he also declined. Then comes the least rational person in our entourage. Horst had not been present during ND's explanation of the night before. Being a chaotic nexus of violent urges, shaped like a teenage boy, he needed his sleep, and a lot of it, so he never arrived at school less than an hour late. So he stumbles in as we're moving to a new class, takes one look at ND, and asks a single question. Who did it? ND, being a nice guy who hadn't even wanted police intervention, sure as hell wouldn't sick horse on these idiots, so he made up some lie about having a concussion and not remembering. Horst doesn't buy it and spends the rest of his day up ND's ass, demanding to know the exact names of everyone involved. ND eventually buckles, reluctantly naming each of the poor idiots who would likely eventually wish that he had gone to the cops instead. Of course, first came violent retribution, Horst's favorite kind. Being an absolutely huge dude, with no regard for his own safety and well-being, and less regard for others, he was a pretty intimidating guy. He spent the rest of the day skipping out on his classes, hunting down each of the guys involved, and beating them until my hands felt wet. His own words. Security stepped in once or twice, handling him with the same bored exasperation they faced all of our school's problems with. We went to a painfully underfunded school with lots of gang/drug/alcohol/pregnancy problems, and so the security swiftly stopped caring about their jobs. And if you couldn't guess, Horst was a bit of a problem student. Horst's real name, what do you think you're doing? They stole from my friend. Security just gave a deep, exasperated sigh, clearly understanding that they can do nothing about a clear violation of the law of the land, and that the slight Horst had faced demanded swift and extrajudicial retaliation. But also they did sort of get paid to make sure that these idiot kids didn't Lord of the Flies themselves out of the gene pool all the time, so some sort of compromise needed to be made for the sake of keeping their jobs. Just don't send him to the hospital, okay? It was a gentleman's agreement, to which Horst obliged. Maybe out of respect for the security guard who dealt with his shit, or maybe because his knuckles were bleeding, and that kinda sucked. Either way, there was a world of options for making their lives a living hell, and Horst intended to explore as many as he could. At least until they broke and took his ultimatum. Give my friend his stuff back, or I won't stop. But they had all weathered a beating. They were high on teenage hubris, and also probably weed. What was the worst he could do? Which is an incredibly stupid question to ask about a guy who once begged me to touch the bone poking out of his broken arm. I was crying more than he was. He proceeded to make the next few weeks hell. There was, of course, the petty things: knocked their lunch out of their hands, swiped homework, locked one of them in the boiler room. Pretty much if you can imagine a bully from an 80s movie doing it. Short of vehicular homicide. What the fuck, gummies? He did it. Then came the heavier stuff. Brought in his dad's bolt cutters in. Like I said, security was hot garbage in this school. Also only ever watched the front doors, leaving back and side doors free to sneak in and out of. And snapped the locks off of 2 of their lockers, as one of them used a master lock. Then proceeded to clear out their stuff. Textbooks, an iPod, which I now own, gym clothes, anything he could get his hands on would be swiped. The valuables would be kept, but things he didn't care about were usually ripped up and left in the hall to be discovered later along with the broken lock. Their cars were his favorite target by far. He stole their hubcaps, slashed their tires, left deep scratches along the side of their cars. One had a dick scratched into their passenger door. At one point he borrowed my tire iron to straight up remove one of their car tires and roll it off into the nearby park, where he ditched it in a patch of dry fenced-off scrub that had yet to be burned back. Which would be a real fun discovery for the park department, I'm sure. He had entertained the idea of getting a skunk into one of their cars, but gave up when he realized we lived in a city and he had no idea of where to get or how to transport a skunk. Backpacks were snatched as well, mostly dumped in the ladies' locker room showers with the water on, though he did light one on fire if memory serves. Textbooks were free unless you ruined them, and then you had to pay out of pocket, and our school was very generous with what ruined meant. Covers fell off. Fine. All the pages are drawn on. Whatever. But if the whole book was destroyed, well, they couldn't do anything for you and had to order a new one on your dime. He tried to tell a teacher that one of them had cheated off him, but given his scholastic history, that was quickly tossed out as dumb and sit back down, Horse's real name. The final nail in the coffin was ruining a senior's relationship with the girl he'd been dating since freshman year. So Horse had quite a few lady friends on account of being a very large, intimidating guy who would take any excuse, like perhaps a pretty girl complaining about a creep, to start a fight. Needless to say, they were keen on helping him out. One girl, I'll call Praying Mantis, decided to help in his crusade. Managed to finest dick pics out of our hapless senior. Of course he had a girlfriend, but he was also a very horny teenager, and PM was a very pretty girl. Sweet-talked him all the way out of his pants, and then proceeded to send every photo to his girlfriend and spin a tale about how she had been blowing him for 6 months now, how she hadn't known that he had a girlfriend, and she felt so bad. Of course, teenage girls are kinda dumb, and PM got called a slut and a bitch and all sorts of other names. But come the next day, we still find the cheating senior's ass very much dumped. After about a month or so of non-stop abuse, Horse never really felt an obligation to go to class, so he could spend all his free time on revenge if need be. Teachers just passed him with D's to get him out of their classes. He reminded them of his ultimatum. That evening, lo and behold, Andy got a knock on his door, and his muggers were back, this time with most of his things in tow. They didn't return everything. I believe a few games and a Blu-ray player were not returned, but ND lied and told Horse he got everything back for the sake of ending his rampage. I do want to say that Horse faced some sort of punishment for his many crimes. However, over his career as my friend, he had informed me of so many suspensions, detentions, and extra work that he never planned to do that it all sort of blended together after a while, and I can't tell you how long he was out of school. But I can say that he was a junior both my junior and senior years.